It was 8:30 a.m. when Ethan Carter, an ambitious up-and-coming lawyer at Daniels and Hayes, received a phone call that would change his life. His boss's assistant informed him that he had been assigned to a special case, something unusual but potentially career-defining if handled correctly. Ethan, always eager to prove his worth, saw this as the opportunity he had been waiting for to demonstrate that he was ready for more than just small contracts and discreet settlements. The client? A man accused of first-degree murder, with evidence against him as flimsy as the reasoning behind his arrest. Still, the case sparked intrigue, especially because the accused insisted he would only trust Ethan to defend him. As Ethan reviewed the client's file, a chill ran down his spine. There wasn't much about the crime itself beyond a nameless victim and an alleged murder weapon that was never found. Witness statements were vague, and the case seemed crafted for a quick conviction. But the most disturbing part was the photo attached to the report. The accused man's face was a perfect copy of Ethan's. Leaning in closer, adjusting his glasses, Ethan stared at the image as if the act could somehow change what he was seeing. Despite the obvious signs of age and wear in the man's features, the resemblance was undeniable. Hours later, with the documents in hand, Ethan drove to the state prison where the client was being held. The ride was quiet, but his thoughts were deafening. How was it possible for someone to look so identical to him? Was this some kind of twisted joke or a gross error? Rationality urged him to treat the meeting like any other initial consultation, but his intuition warned that something much bigger was about to unfold. When he arrived at the prison, he was greeted by guards who seemed more suspicious than usual. The environment was claustrophobic, the hallways cold and lifeless. Ethan was led to a private visitation room where he would finally meet the man claiming to be his client. As the heavy door creaked open, the sight before him almost made him step back. Sitting at the table, cuffed and wearing an expression that shifted between exhaustion and determination, was someone who could have been his reflection in a mirror warped by time. The man, officially identified as Elijah Carter, stared at him with an intensity that was both unsettling and magnetic. A faint, enigmatic smile appeared on his face as he said, "I knew you'd come. After all, no one knows you better than yourself." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach but maintained his composure. Ignoring the comment, he opened his briefcase and began reviewing the documents to focus on the case. Yet Elijah's voice echoed in the room, interrupting his attempt to rationalize the situation. "You must be wondering how this is possible. I am you, Ethan. From the future." At first, Ethan thought it was a desperate attempt to confuse or manipulate him. However, the way Elijah described events and memories that no one else could possibly know started to chip away at his skepticism. He detailed Ethan's car accident at 16, the nickname his mother used before she passed away, even the scar Ethan had recently gotten in a household mishap, all with uncanny precision. Trying to shake off the growing discomfort, Ethan focused on questioning Elijah about the crime. But the man dodged direct questions, preferring to speak in cryptic statements. "The crime doesn't matter. What matters is what you're going to do. I'm here because you're about to make a mistake that will destroy everything." Their meeting was cut short when a guard announced that their time was up. Elijah leaned forward, forcing Ethan to hear his final words before being escorted back to his cell. "Investigate. You'll find the truth. But be careful of Orbis. They're always watching." Ethan left the prison with more questions than answers. The name Orbis echoed in his mind, but it wasn't mentioned anywhere in the case documents. Elijah's words, though absurd, carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The drive back to the office was a blur of chaotic thoughts as he debated whether to take Elijah's claims seriously or dismiss them as the ramblings of a desperate man. That evening, back at home, Ethan spent hours staring at Elijah's photo. The resemblance continued to haunt him. He knew he had to decide how to proceed, but the feeling that something much bigger was at play made it impossible to think clearly. For the first time in his career, Ethan felt he might be dealing with a case he couldn't control. Back at the office, Ethan tried to concentrate on the case files, but his mind kept circling back to Elijah's unsettling presence. The prisoner's story echoed like an unsolvable riddle. The fact that someone so identical to him existed was already bizarre, but the way Elijah seemed to know such intimate details about his life transformed discomfort into an almost obsessive unease. The first few hours were spent reviewing reports and witness statements. The gaps in the investigation were glaring, more than just simple incompetence. The witnesses listed in the case were vague and inconsistent, as if they'd been coached to avoid providing specifics. No solid evidence connected Elijah to the crime, just an account that he had allegedly been seen near the scene. As for the murder itself, it was described as brutal but with no apparent motive or link between the victim and the accused. Something about the case felt deeply wrong, and Ethan knew he'd have to dig deeper. Even so, the name Orbis was nowhere in the documents. It was like a ghost, existing only in the mind of the prisoner or in a place no one dared to record. That absence, however, made Ethan question if he was missing something. He decided to visit the court records office to search for additional information, but his request was denied under the excuse that the case was sealed to protect ongoing investigations. Ethan had never encountered anything like this, especially in a case so thin on evidence. The coincidences started to pile up. Later that afternoon, as he went over the files again, Ethan noticed something that made him freeze. In one of the photos attached to the prison records, Elijah had a scar on the side of his face identical to the one Ethan had recently gotten after accidentally cutting himself while opening a wine bottle. The wound on Ethan was still healing, but Elijah's scar looked aged, as though it had been there for years. Ethan stood abruptly, his heart pounding. It was a coincidence too impossible to ignore. No matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the pieces refused to fit into any logical framework. Ethan didn't believe in time travel, but how else could he explain the scar? How could anyone know so much about him? To Ethan, there were only two options: either Elijah was a master manipulator with access to impossible information, or he was telling the truth. Doubt drove Ethan into a desperate search for answers. He decided to visit the house where he had grown up, hoping to unearth some memory or connection that could shed light on the mystery. The place had been empty since his mother passed away, but the hallway smelled of nostalgia and abandonment. In the attic, he sifted through boxes of old documents, journals, and photos. Nothing seemed relevant until he found something that made him stop cold. It was a letter addressed to him, written in his handwriting, but the date in the upper corner was 15 years in the future. The message was short and disjointed, almost as if it had been written in a hurry. Don't trust them. Orbis lies. You can't escape the cycle. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but the idea of having written something 15 years from now was too absurd to accept. A heavy weight settled in his chest, the air in the room growing denser. Reality seemed to twist around him, and for the first time, he felt as though he was entangled in something far beyond a legal case, a conspiracy that defied comprehension. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office determined to confront whoever had assigned him to the case. His boss, David Hayes, avoided his questions, brushing him off with a vague explanation about it being a high-level decision. That only deepened Ethan's suspicions. When he tried to get answers from his colleagues, he was met with closed doors and uneasy glances. No one wanted to discuss the case, as if it were taboo. The few responses he managed to extract hinted at a long-standing relationship between the firm and private entities like Orbis, particularly in contracts involving experimental technology. The pressure escalated later that day when Ethan received a call from an unknown number. The male voice on the other end, calm but devoid of emotion, said, "Stop digging. Some things aren't meant to be understood." Before Ethan could reply, the call disconnected. The warning felt more like a threat, yet it only strengthened his resolve to dig deeper. The fallout from that warning became clear soon after. Ethan discovered that his computer had been remotely accessed, with many of the case files corrupted or mysteriously missing. The obvious attempt at intimidation only confirmed what he was beginning to suspect: he was dealing with something far bigger than a simple criminal defense case. Still, he wasn't entirely alone. Clara Bennett, an investigative journalist he had worked with before, took an interest in the case after Ethan casually mentioned the name Orbis. Clara had a reputation for being relentless, someone who wouldn't back down from a fight, which was exactly what Ethan needed. She promised to help but warned him that going after powerful corporations rarely ended well. That night, while Clara combed through old archives for links between Orbis and similar cases, Ethan replayed his last conversation with Elijah in his mind. Every word seemed to carry meanings he hadn't noticed before. Something was about to change, and Ethan knew the next piece of the puzzle wouldn't be easy to find. The line between reality and the absurd was becoming increasingly blurred, but he was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant putting his own life at risk. The following days were a mixture of growing tension and a sense of urgency that Ethan couldn't shake. Every new piece of the puzzle seemed to raise more questions than answers. While Clara pushed forward with her investigation, Ethan dove deeper into the logic, or lack thereof, behind the case. His determination kept him vigilant, but it also attracted unwanted attention. One afternoon, while Ethan was at his desk reviewing the sparse details of the case, Victor Walsh, one of Daniels and Hayes' most respected partners, walked in unannounced. Victor was known for his ability to close impossible deals, a man who always seemed to be in control. But this afternoon, there was something different in his tone. He seemed unusually cordial, almost friendly, as he approached Ethan's desk. "We need to talk," Victor said, his gaze cutting through Ethan like a blade. Ethan felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension but agreed to follow Victor to a private meeting room. There, Victor presented an offer that sounded too good to be true. He explained that Orbis was one of the firm's key partners and that a unique opportunity had arisen for Ethan to be part of a high-stakes legal project involving advanced technology patents. According to Victor, the contract could catapult Ethan's career to unimaginable heights. Victor's tone was calm, but every word carried a weight that made it clear this was no ordinary offer. There was something in his eyes, a calculated glint, that suggested he knew far more than he was letting on. Ethan listened carefully as Victor detailed the benefits: substantial financial bonuses, access to elite circles, and, most importantly, visibility in the legal world. But behind all the promises, there was an unspoken subtext that Ethan couldn't ignore. Orbis was at the center of it all, and accepting the contract would mean stepping deep into the corporation's shadow. Leaving the meeting, Ethan felt torn. The offer seemed irresistible in terms of professional advancement, but something about the way Victor had framed it felt deeply unsettling. And then, as if the universe conspired to deepen his confusion, Ethan received a message from Clara later that evening. She had uncovered something that might change everything. The files Clara had found showed a disturbing pattern. In a series of seemingly unrelated legal disputes, Orbis' name kept appearing. It was always in the context of confidential contracts, controversial experiments, or patent disputes involving experimental technology. But one detail stood out to Clara: many of the people involved in these cases had mysteriously disappeared, including lawyers, witnesses, and even judges. Ethan listened intently as Clara laid out the details, a growing sense of dread settling over him. It wasn't just Orbis' name that terrified him, it was the relentless pattern of how they operated. Clara ended her explanation with a simple but loaded question. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" The doubt Clara planted made Ethan reflect on his situation. He was being drawn into something that felt bigger than anything he'd ever faced. But there was something deeper, a personal connection he couldn't ignore. The name Orbis, the identical prisoner, the gaps in the case, everything seemed to orbit around a hidden truth that was slowly consuming him. Despite his hesitation, Ethan knew he had to confront Victor again. If there was more behind the offer, he needed to find out before making any decision. When he returned to the office the next day, Victor was waiting for him, as if he had already anticipated Ethan's return. The conversation started politely but quickly evolved into a game of veiled manipulation. Victor mentioned how Ethan had potential and how it would be a shame if he chose the wrong path. That's when Victor let something slip that made Ethan freeze. He mentioned a confidential program within Orbis, something involving scientific and psychological advancements that would change the world. Victor didn't go into detail, but the words were enough to trigger every alarm in Ethan's mind. He remembered Elijah's warnings and Clara's discoveries. It was impossible to ignore the fact that he was being pulled into something far larger than a simple legal case. That night, Ethan met with Clara again to discuss what he had learned. The two sat in a quiet cafe, away from the watchful eyes that seemed to follow them everywhere. Clara, ever pragmatic, suggested that Ethan decline the offer and distance himself from the case. But Ethan knew that wasn't an option. He felt trapped in something he couldn't walk away from even if he wanted to. "I can't just back out," Ethan said, his voice firm in a way that surprised even himself. Clara hesitated before responding, but the look in her eyes was one of genuine concern. "Then we need to find out what they're really hiding." In the days that followed, Ethan and Clara worked together to uncover more about Orbis. Each new discovery brought them closer to a reality that seemed increasingly absurd and dangerous. They found records of experiments involving mental manipulation, described in vague but alarming terms. The documents suggested the corporation was developing technology capable of altering memories and influencing decisions. Meanwhile, the pressure on Ethan continued to mount. Victor kept pushing him to sign the contract, while Elijah's warnings echoed in his mind. Every choice seemed to lead to a dead end. And then, just when things couldn't get any more tense, Clara was attacked. She survived, but it was clear they were being watched. The attack on Clara was a breaking point for Ethan. He knew he couldn't trust anyone at the firm, least of all Victor. But he also knew that running away wasn't an option. The only way out was to face the truth, no matter the cost. While driving back home that night, Ethan noticed he was being followed. The black car in his rearview mirror never strayed far but also didn't attempt to overtake him. The message was clear: he wasn't in control. When he finally arrived at his apartment, he found the door slightly ajar. For a moment, he considered turning back, but something drove him to go inside. On the table in the living room was a single envelope. Inside was a contract with the Orbis logo at the top. It was identical to the one Victor had shown him, but this time, a handwritten note was scrawled across the bottom. "You have no choice." Ethan felt the weight of his situation press down on him harder than ever. He was surrounded by forces that seemed to know his every move, as if they were always one step ahead. But at the same time, there was something inside him that refused to give in. He knew he couldn't sign the contract without fully understanding what was behind it. And so, as the night enveloped the city, Ethan made his decision. He would confront Orbis, uncover the truth, and find a way to break free. Even if it meant sacrificing everything. Ethan woke early, but the weight of the previous night's decision left him feeling like he hadn't slept at all. The Orbis contract still sat on the table, a looming reminder of the dilemma he couldn't escape. He locked it away in a drawer, as if that could keep the pressure at bay. But deep down, he knew the only way to overcome this was to face the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. Clara arrived at his apartment not long after, her face tense as she checked the windows and doors repeatedly. Ethan noticed the cuts on her hand, likely from her struggle during the recent attack. Despite the obvious strain, her determination hadn't wavered. "I found something," she said, sitting at Ethan's table with a stack of files. "I don't know if it's everything we need, but it's a start." She had uncovered documents linking Orbis to a research facility on the outskirts of the city. Officially described as a center for advanced cognitive technologies, Clara's investigation hinted at something far more sinister. Through vague reports and anonymous testimonies, she learned the facility was used for experiments on prisoners, many of whom were never seen again. The descriptions alluded to psychological manipulation, mind control, and even induced states of altered consciousness. "They're testing something, Ethan," Clara continued, spreading the papers across the table. "Something that can rewrite memories, manipulate decisions, maybe even control behavior. If this is true, it could explain what Elijah's been trying to warn you about. He might not be lying." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The connection between Orbis and the prisoner seemed to be solidifying, but accepting that Elijah was telling the truth felt like a leap too far. He shook his head, trying to suppress the growing doubt. "This doesn't prove anything. They might be involved in something illegal, but it doesn't mean Elijah is who he says he is." Clara stopped and stared at him. "What more do you need? You know something's wrong, Ethan. They're trying to manipulate you. If you don't act now, it might be too late." The intensity in her words hit Ethan like a punch. He knew Clara was right, but acknowledging the truth would mean letting go of the last vestiges of normalcy in his life. Later that day, Ethan decided to investigate the facility. He knew it was risky, but his need for answers outweighed his fear. Clara had managed to track down the address, warning that the area was heavily guarded. Ethan arrived near the property as night fell, parking far enough away to avoid drawing attention. Using binoculars, he observed the facility from a distance: tall fences, security cameras, and guards patrolling regularly. There was no question they were protecting something important. As he watched, a black van pulled into the property. The Orbis logo was discreetly painted on its side, but what caught Ethan's attention was the man who stepped out of the vehicle. He was short and unassuming, but there was something about the way he spoke to the guards that conveyed authority. Ethan recognized the face immediately. It was Victor Walsh. His firm's partner was deeply entangled with Orbis in ways Ethan could never have imagined. That night, Ethan and Clara reviewed everything they had uncovered so far. Victor was a critical link, but he was also carefully protected by Orbis. Known for his charm and charisma, Victor now seemed more like a facade for something far more sinister. Clara suggested that exposing Victor might be the key to dismantling the connection between Orbis and the illegal experiments, but Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy. Over the following days, Ethan began noticing signs that he was being followed. Parked cars near his building, unfamiliar faces in familiar places, even missed calls from unknown numbers. The constant sense of being watched became a suffocating reminder that every move he made was under scrutiny. Yet he didn't stop. Instead, he used Clara's documents to dig deeper into Victor's involvement with Orbis. During one late-night research session, Ethan stumbled upon something that left him speechless. Buried in a forgotten folder within Clara's files was a list of names. Some were prisoners, others researchers, but one name stood out: Elijah Carter. The name was highlighted as one of the subjects involved in a project labeled Primary Cycle. There were no details about what this meant, but the implication was clear. Elijah was directly connected to Orbis experiments, and somehow, so was Ethan. "This isn't a coincidence," Clara said when Ethan showed her the discovery. "They've planned this from the beginning. It's not just about Elijah. It's about you, too." The revelation shook Ethan to his core. He remembered Elijah's words about the cycle and began to question whether his own life had been manipulated in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. But before he could fully process it, an anonymous message appeared on Clara's phone. It was a video, seemingly recorded from a security camera. It showed Clara sitting in a cafe, typing on her laptop. The image wobbled slightly, as if whoever was filming wanted her to know she was being watched. "They know everything," Ethan whispered as he showed Clara the video. "We're not safe." Clara tried to remain calm, but the tension in her face was undeniable. They knew they couldn't continue investigating without taking even greater risks. But at the same time, retreating would mean letting Orbis win. It would mean accepting that they were trapped in a web they couldn't escape. That night, Ethan made a decision. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help from someone who understood the enemy as well as he now did. For the first time since the case began, he decided to return to the prison. He needed to hear more from Elijah, to understand what was really happening. As the night deepened, Ethan drove toward the penitentiary, Clara by his side. The silence in the car was heavy, as if they both knew they were crossing a point of no return. When they parked in the prison's lot, Ethan turned to Clara, who simply nodded in quiet affirmation. He took a deep breath before stepping out of the car, determined to confront the prisoner who claimed to be his future self. "Let's find out what they don't want us to know," Ethan muttered to himself as he walked through the prison gates. The cold prison hallways felt even more oppressive that night. Ethan walked with steady steps, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn back. He knew this meeting would be pivotal. Elijah's words, once dismissed as delusional, now carried an unbearable weight. Clara stayed behind in the car, ready to act if anything went wrong. It was a necessary precaution, considering everything they had uncovered about Orbis. When the steel door of the visitation room opened, Elijah was there, sitting in the same position Ethan had seen him in during their first encounter. The prisoner's shoulders were hunched, his gaze distant, but as soon as Ethan entered, he lifted his head. It was as if Elijah already knew why he had returned. "You came back," Elijah said, his voice a mixture of relief and sorrow. "That means they're closing in on you." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across the table, locking eyes with Elijah. This time, he didn't bother hiding his discomfort or confusion. Instead, he went straight to the point. "I need answers. You said you're my future, that we're stuck in a cycle. What does that really mean?" Elijah leaned forward, his every word deliberate, as though each one cost him energy to say. "Orbis isn't just a corporation. It's an experiment. They're not interested in technology or mind control, they're testing something much bigger, reality itself. And we're part of it, Ethan. From the beginning." Ethan shook his head, struggling to process the idea. The words sounded absurd, but at the same time every piece of the puzzle seemed to fall into place. Elijah continued, describing how Orbis used advanced technology to create temporal loops, replaying specific events to manipulate large-scale outcomes. The primary cycle program wasn't just a scientific endeavor, it was a method of absolute control. "Why me?" Ethan asked, frustration edging his voice. "What do I have to do with any of this?" Elijah stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Because you're the trigger. Everything that happens, every choice that leads to this moment, revolves around you. They need you to make a specific decision for the cycle to continue. That's why I'm here, to stop you from making the wrong choice." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He remembered the contract, Victor's pressure, and Clara's warnings. Everything seemed to converge toward one point. "You signed it, didn't you?" Ethan asked, already knowing the answer from the look in Elijah's eyes. "That's what brought you here." Elijah nodded slowly. "I thought I could beat them at their own game. I thought signing the contract would give me the leverage to dismantle Orbis from the inside. But it was a trap. They didn't just control my life, they turned me into this. He gestured at himself, as though his very existence was proof of Orbis' corruption. Ethan tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him like a shadow. What if Elijah was right? What if signing the contract meant losing everything? Still, something about the story didn't sit well with Ethan. He leaned forward, his voice low and determined. Why did you say you're me? That doesn't make sense. I don't believe in time travel. Elijah gave a bitter smile. It's not time travel in the traditional sense. They don't send people back. They copy. They recreate memories, traumas, decisions, and they build a replicated version of you to manipulate the cycle. I'm a projection of who you'll become if you take the wrong path. But I'm still you, Ethan. And you can still change everything. Elijah's words echoed in Ethan's mind as he left the room. He didn't know who to trust, but one thing was clear: Orbis was the enemy. To fight them, he needed proof. Back in the car, Clara was waiting with a serious expression. Ethan explained everything Elijah had revealed, each word adding to the weight of what they were facing. Despite her natural skepticism, Clara couldn't deny the evidence they had gathered. Every clue pointed to the fact that Elijah was telling the truth. If he's right, we can't wait any longer, Clara said. We need to expose Orbis now, before it's too late. The next several nights were consumed by an intense investigation. Clara used her network to gain access to confidential files, while Ethan tracked down people who had worked with Orbis in the past. Most were too scared to speak, but one anonymous source agreed to meet them. The man, identified only as Reed, was a former researcher who had fled after uncovering the corporation's true agenda. The meeting took place in a run-down motel on the outskirts of the city. Reed was thin, with sunken eyes that betrayed his sleepless nights. He confirmed everything Elijah had said: Orbis was conducting experiments on temporal and mental manipulation. But there was something even more unsettling. They're testing the recreation of historical events on a personal scale, Reed explained. Not just memories, but entire realities. Every time someone like you makes a choice that benefits Orbis, the cycle resets. And each time, they refine the process. Ethan felt an unbearable weight settle over him. His life wasn't just manipulated, it was being used as part of an experiment with no end in sight. He wanted to fight back, but how could he confront something so vast and intangible? As they left the motel, Clara received a text message from an unknown number. It read simply, "It's done." Moments later, a car sped into the parking lot. Ethan and Clara barely had time to hide before the vehicle came to a screeching halt. Two men got out, both armed, and stormed into Reed's room. The muffled sounds of shouting were followed by an eerie silence. Clara grabbed Ethan's arm, her eyes wide with panic. They know we're here. We need to leave. Now. Ethan didn't have time to think. They ran back to their car, the sound of footsteps and voices growing closer. As they drove away, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the motel lights fade into the distance. Reed was gone, but his words lingered. Ethan and Clara now had a new mission: dismantle the cycle before it consumed them. The streets were nearly empty as Ethan and Clara drove in silence, the sound of the car engine masking their ragged breaths. The attack at the motel had made it clear just how dangerous their situation had become. Orbis wasn't a distant threat, it was a force willing to kill to protect its secrets. Ethan knew there was no turning back. They needed to act quickly, and the only person who might help them now was Elijah. The next morning, Ethan returned to the penitentiary, this time determined to extract definitive answers. Clara stayed outside, scanning the area with a heightened sense of awareness. The security seemed tighter than usual, as though Orbis had already begun closing its net. When Ethan entered the visitation room, Elijah was sitting in the same position, his face pale and drawn. Yet, when Ethan walked in, he straightened, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "Do you believe me now?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but laced with exhaustion. Ethan sat down, resting his elbows on the table as he stared at the man across from him. "I believe something's very wrong. But I still don't fully believe you. I need concrete proof. I need to understand how this works." Elijah exhaled heavily and leaned forward, his tired eyes locked on Ethan's. "They offered you the contract, didn't they?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. "That's how it begins. They make it seem like you have a choice, but it's all an illusion. Once you sign, your life isn't yours anymore." Ethan clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. "If all of this is true, why are you here? Why would Orbis let you warn me?" Elijah stared at him for a long moment before replying. "Because I'm part of their plan. They know that deep down, you'll ignore me. That's how the cycle repeats." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to refute them, but something in Elijah's expression stopped him. There was a brutal honesty in his eyes, a truth that Ethan couldn't deny. Before Ethan could ask another question, Elijah continued. "But this time is different. This time, you have Clara. She's the variable that can change everything. But you need to act now. They're getting closer, Ethan. And when they make their move, it'll be too late." Their conversation was interrupted as the door to the room suddenly opened. A guard stepped inside, looking more nervous than usual. "The visit's over," he said, his voice steady but betraying a slight tremor. Ethan tried to protest, but Elijah shook his head and gave one final warning. "Don't sign. No matter what happens, Ethan. Don't sign." The walk back to the car felt longer than usual. Clara waited, her face tense with worry. "Anything new?" she asked as Ethan slid into the passenger seat. He shook his head, his mind still spinning from Elijah's words. But before he could respond, Clara pointed to the rearview mirror. "I think we're being followed." Ethan glanced back and saw a black car trailing them at a careful distance. He tried to stay calm, but panic began to rise in his chest. Without saying a word, he pressed his foot down on the accelerator, weaving through traffic to try to shake their pursuer. Clara kept her eyes on the mirror, guiding him as the chase intensified. The streets became a blur of sharp turns and ignored signals. The black car remained relentless, but Ethan finally managed to lose it by darting into a narrow alley and parking behind an abandoned building. They sat in silence, catching their breath, as they watched the entrance to the alley for any sign of movement. After a few tense minutes, Clara finally whispered, "I think we lost them." The silence was broken by the buzz of Ethan's phone. He looked at the screen and saw an unknown number. Hesitating, he answered, and the voice on the other end sent a chill through his body. "You can't run, Ethan. Sign the contract, and this all ends." The call disconnected before he could respond. Ethan felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him, each step drawing him closer to an invisible edge. Clara watched him carefully, waiting for him to speak, but Ethan simply restarted the car and drove back to his apartment. That night, Ethan finally decided to open the contract Victor had given him. He read it line by line, searching for any clue or detail that might confirm Elijah's warnings. At first glance, the document seemed harmless. It was a standard agreement with clauses about confidentiality and timelines. Nothing about it explicitly indicated the kind of manipulation Elijah had described. But then, buried near the end of the contract, Ethan found a clause that seemed out of place. Written in dense legal jargon, it stated that by signing, he would agree to participate in cognitive innovation experiments conducted by Orbis. The words made his stomach churn. Elijah had been right. The contract wasn't just a professional agreement, it was an entry point into something far more dangerous. The next morning, Ethan showed the clause to Clara. She read it in silence before finally speaking. This is what they do. They hide the truth in places no one bothers to look. But now you know. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Ethan knew his answer would be critical. He couldn't simply ignore the contract or destroy it. Orbis was too powerful to let him walk away so easily. But signing it would mean surrendering his freedom, possibly even his life. He looked at Clara, her expression firm and unwavering. We fight. We expose everything. Clara nodded, though there was worry in her eyes. They both knew time was running out. And as the morning light crept into the room, Ethan felt the looming confrontation drawing ever closer. The next morning arrived like a heavy tide, bringing with it a sense of urgency Ethan couldn't ignore. He spent hours rereading the contract, each clause pounding in his mind like a warning bell. The weight of his decision hung in the air, and the ever-present feeling of being watched made it harder to think clearly. Clara arrived at his apartment with a serious expression, holding a new discovery. She'd managed to access internal Orbis records through an anonymous contact. What she found didn't just confirm the experiments Reed had mentioned, it revealed that the primary cycle program had been active far longer than they'd suspected. They target people in key positions, Clara explained, spreading the files across the table. Lawyers, judges, executives. Anyone who can help them reach their goals. They create these loops, manipulating their lives until they get the perfect result. Ethan scanned the papers, his stomach tightening with each line. Many of the names in the files were marked as completed, while others were flagged as still in progress. At the center of it all was his own name, highlighted and bolded with a single word beside it, indeterminate. I'm next, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, though her eyes glimmered with determination. Not if they can't control you. The only way to stop this is to expose Orbis before they finish the cycle. We have to make it public. Before Ethan could respond, a sharp knock at the door shattered their focus. He froze, exchanging a tense glance with Clara. Both of them knew this wasn't a friendly visit. Clara slipped into the bedroom while Ethan hesitated, then opened the door. Two men in suits stood on the other side, their faces cold and unreadable. One handed Ethan a sealed envelope, while the other spoke in a low, threatening tone. Victor wants to see you. Now. Ethan knew refusing wasn't an option. He gave Clara one last look, silently conveying a message: if something happens, keep going. The car ride to the meeting was silent, the interior of the vehicle suffocating despite its luxury. The men said nothing, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. When they arrived, he was led into a discreet yet imposing building. The inside was sleek and clinical, the silence broken only by the sound of his footsteps echoing in the corridor. Victor waited in a spacious, brightly lit room. He sat behind a glass desk, his polished smile as sharp as a knife. Ethan, I'm glad you came. Please, have a seat. Ethan complied, keeping his posture stiff and his eyes focused on Victor, prepared for whatever was coming. Victor's demeanor was relaxed, but every word he spoke carried the weight of control. You've been stirring up a lot of unnecessary trouble, my friend. Digging into things that aren't your concern, associating with dangerous people. That has to stop. Ethan felt anger bubbling under his calm exterior, but he forced himself to stay composed. You want me to stop? Then explain the primary cycle. Explain why Orbis is manipulating lives like pawns on a chessboard. Victor chuckled softly, as if the question were amusing. Ethan, you're trying to understand something beyond your comprehension. The cycle is a tool, a way to create optimal outcomes in an imperfect world. You should be proud to be part of it. Proud? Ethan snapped, his voice rising. You're destroying lives. Using people as experiments. Victor's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, steely expression. Do you really think you have a choice? You're already in the cycle, Ethan. From the moment you received that contract, you belong to us. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Ethan knew Victor was partly right. Orbis already had a grip on his life in ways he couldn't fully understand. But he also knew he couldn't give in without a fight. Victor leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Sign the contract, Ethan. If you do, you'll have everything you've ever wanted: success, power, stability. If you don't, well, let's just say the consequences won't be pleasant. For a moment, Ethan sat frozen. Victor's words echoed in his mind, mixing with the warnings of Elijah. Every choice seemed to lead to a dead end. But he needed time to think. Sensing Ethan's hesitation, Victor leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile returning. I'll give you one last chance, Ethan. Think carefully. After all, this isn't just about you. The meeting ended, and Ethan was escorted back to the car. The ride home felt even heavier than before, the silence oppressive. Back at the apartment, Clara was waiting, her eyes filled with questions. What happened? She asked, tension thick in her voice. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. They want me to sign. But I think signing or refusing doesn't matter anymore. They already have control. Clara shook her head, her determination unwavering. Not yet. We can still expose them. But we have to move fast. The two spent the next several hours forming a plan. Clara would use the files they'd gathered to contact a trusted journalist, while Ethan searched for one last piece of evidence that could definitively incriminate Orbis. Both knew they were racing against the clock. Orbis was closing in, and the margin for error was almost non-existent. That night, Ethan revisited the letter he'd found in his childhood home. The words echoed in his mind, "You can't escape the cycle." But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he couldn't escape it, but he could break it. And with Clara by his side, he was determined to do just that. As the early hours of morning crept closer, Ethan looked at the contract one last time. The decision was made, but he knew the real fight was just beginning. The night felt endless. Ethan's apartment was cloaked in an oppressive silence as he and Clara sifted through the files one last time. Every document, every line of text, was another piece of the puzzle revealing the full scope of Orbis' control. And yet, none of it felt like enough. Taking down a corporation as powerful as Orbis would require more than evidence, it would require survival. Clara was on the phone, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone to her source in the press. Her words carried an edge of desperation, as though she knew time was running out. Meanwhile, Ethan sat at the table, the Orbis contract in front of him like a taunting reminder of what was at stake. His eyes locked on the clause that had haunted him ever since he'd found it: participation in cognitive innovation experiments. Suddenly, Clara hung up and turned to him, her expression grim. They know. My source says Orbis is already aware of what we're trying to do. We don't have much time. Before Ethan could respond, the screech of tires outside broke the stillness. He moved to the window and saw two black cars pull up to the curb. Men in dark suits stepped out, moving with military precision. There was no question, Orbis had come for them. "We need to go," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. Ethan didn't argue. He grabbed the most critical files, stuffing them into a backpack, and followed Clara out the back door. They crept down the shadowed corridors of the building, their footsteps muffled by the sound of approaching boots. The men were already inside, their voices echoing faintly through the halls. Every second felt like an eternity as Ethan and Clara navigated their way to the street. The air outside was cold and sharp as they darted into a nearby alley. They avoided the main roads, sticking to narrow pathways and dimly lit corners. But the sense of being hunted was constant, as though Orbis eyes were everywhere. They finally reached an abandoned warehouse that Clara had scouted earlier as a potential fallback point. Inside, the air smelled of rust and dust, but at least it offered a temporary refuge. Ethan slumped against a wall, trying to catch his breath, while Clara pulled out the files from the backpack to ensure nothing was lost. "We can't keep running," Ethan said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We have to face them." Clara turned to him, her eyes blazing with determination. "Then let's do it. Let's expose everything. Now." She opened her laptop and began uploading the files to a secure cloud. Ethan helped organize the documents, but their focus was shattered by the sound of footsteps outside. Someone had found them. Clara shut the laptop and handed it to Ethan. "Go. I'll buy you time." "No." Ethan protested, but Clara was already moving toward the door, her resolve unshakable. The footsteps grew louder, and men's voices filled the space. Clara stepped into the corridor, and Ethan heard the muffled sound of confrontation. His instinct was to run to her, but he knew that would jeopardize everything. Clutching the laptop, he found an exit at the back of the warehouse and slipped into the night. Ethan ran aimlessly, his grip on the laptop tightening with each step. He finally stopped in a deserted park, collapsing onto a bench. The silence around him was almost deafening. But then, Clara's phone, still in his pocket, buzzed. Hesitating, Ethan answered, and the voice on the other end froze him in place. "You see now, Ethan? It doesn't matter what you do. The cycle always continues." It was Victor. His tone was calm, almost mocking. Clara was just collateral damage. Sign the contract, and this all stops. Or you know what happens next. The line went dead, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of the choice before him. He stared at the laptop, knowing he still had the power to expose everything. But at what cost? Clara had risked everything to get them to this point, and now it was up to him to see it through. Yet Victor's and Elijah's warnings echoed relentlessly in his mind. What if there really was no escape? Ethan stood, the laptop still in his hands, and began walking. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he felt the pull of inevitability. He couldn't run forever. The only way to beat Orbis was to confront them, even if it meant sacrificing himself. The night stretched on as Ethan wandered through the city, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. The shadows seemed alive, as if the city itself were watching him. But despite everything, a strange calm began to settle over him. For the first time, he felt like he understood his role. He couldn't undo the past or erase the cycle, but he could fight back. As he reached the edge of the city, the sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Ethan looked up at the stars barely visible above the skyline. He didn't know what would come next, but he was ready to face it. The sun was rising as Ethan arrived at the place he knew was at the heart of Orbis. A towering building, surrounded by high walls and cameras that seemed to track his every movement. He was exhausted, battered, but resolute. The laptop containing the evidence was still clutched in his hands, the last thread of hope that he could bring Orbis down. He knew crossing those doors meant facing the unknown, but there was no turning back. The lobby was vast and intimidating. A security guard intercepted him immediately, but before he could speak, Victor appeared. Dressed impeccably, Victor exuded calm authority, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. "So, you finally understand," Victor said with a slight smile. "Welcome to the end of the cycle." Ethan held Victor's gaze, gripping the laptop tightly. "You think you can control everything. But I'm going to end this. I'll expose you." Victor chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Expose us?" "Ethan, even if the entire world saw those files, nothing would change. Orbis isn't just a corporation, it's an idea. And ideas can't be destroyed." He gestured, and two men in suits approached. Ethan hugged the laptop to his chest, refusing to let it go. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Sign the contract, Ethan. You think you're fighting back, but the cycle always brings you back to me. Sign, and at least you'll have the illusion of control. Refuse, and you'll just be another discarded piece." For a moment, Ethan stood frozen. Victor's words echoed in his mind, weaving together with Elijah's warnings. It felt like a perfectly crafted trap, one that had been set long before Ethan even knew he was a player. But then, something shifted. He thought of Clara, of her fight and her sacrifice. He thought of Reed, of Elijah, and everyone crushed under the weight of the cycle. And, for the first time, he felt clarity. Ethan looked at Victor, a cold smile forming on his lips. "You might control a lot of things. But not my choice." Before anyone could react, Ethan slammed the laptop to the floor, shattering it under his boot. Victor's calm facade cracked for just a second, replaced by something darker. "You think that changes anything?" Victor said, his voice icy. Ethan met his gaze, unwavering. "Maybe not. But at least I'm not part of the game anymore." The two security guards grabbed Ethan, dragging him into a darkened hallway. He didn't resist. He knew Orbis had the power to do whatever it wanted, but a strange sense of victory settled over him. For the first time, he had broken the pattern, made a choice that wasn't part of their plan. In the dim room where they left him, silence surrounded Ethan, broken only by the faint hum of distant machinery. He waited, knowing something would happen soon. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Victor who entered, it was Elijah. "I told you there was no escape," Elijah said, his voice heavy with a mix of sadness and relief. "But you've done what I couldn't. You broke the cycle." Ethan stared at him, trying to piece together the meaning of his words. Elijah sat across from him, his posture slumped but his eyes sharp. "They'll still try, but now you're a variable they can't predict. And that's more powerful than any contract." Before Ethan could respond, the door opened again, and two guards entered, pulling Elijah out of the room. His parting words hung in the air. "Don't let them take that from you." Hours later, without explanation, Ethan was released. The Orbis building loomed behind him as he stepped onto the street. The city seemed almost indifferent, unaware of the battle he had just fought. He wandered aimlessly, the events of the past days replaying in his mind. He didn't feel like he had won, but he knew something had changed. At a park bench, Ethan finally stopped. The sun shone faintly through the city skyline, casting long shadows on the ground. He sat quietly, closing his eyes and letting the morning breeze wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. Orbis still existed, as powerful as ever. But Ethan knew he had planted a seed, a crack in their perfect system. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was no longer afraid. He opened his eyes and looked at the horizon, the sunlight reflecting off distant buildings. And if someone was watching him? He wouldn't know. For now, it didn't matter.